Hello and welcome. I'm really pleased you could join me for the latest episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast. Now, it may not surprise you to know that 3 million people in the UK are chronically lonely, which has a huge impact on their lives. I wanted to find out why this is a growing issue, how it impacts older adults, and importantly, what can be done to help. So I invited Robin Hewings, Program Director of the Campaign to End Loneliness, to talk to me and share his great work. In a world that can feel a very threatening place for a lonely person, how can we as a community or individual help? So without further ado, here are Robin's suggestions on how we can reconnect and lift someone's day. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, Robin Hewings.
Thank you very much for having me.
Robin, I've been really looking forward to our conversation, and obviously it's just we've just entered the new year. I'm not sure exactly when this is going to go out, but we've just gone through Christmas time, and you've got a speciality in your work. Tell me a little bit about what you do and about you and your background and what you're currently doing.
Yeah, so we were founded just over a decade ago because there were a lot of people working on loneliness, whether in charities, in academic research, or in different parts of government and the public sector, and also the private sector as well. And they didn't really have a place to come together and to make the case for this issue, and also to kind of bring together the different types of evidence that there is. So bringing together the experience of people who are working to tackle loneliness together with the more kind of formal academic research as well. So we have been a place over the last decade to bring people together to develop that evidence base, and also to make the case that this isn't just this slightly sad thing that people write songs about. This is something which is having a serious impact on people's lives, but also something that we can do something about collectively as well.
Yeah. So, loneliness, if you've ever suffered from it, or you know someone who does, or is, it is that it's a lonely problem to have, isn't it? I mean, this is the classic kind of perfect storm, is that if you're suffering from it, it's kind of like you don't even know what to do about it because you're suffering from it. So therefore, you're ending up in a spiral. Taking a step back though for a second, is loneliness? How big is the problem? And then also, is this a new problem?
So, it's a big problem in that over 3 million people would say that they are chronically lonely. And what that means is exactly the kind of what you've just been talking about, that kind of downward spiral. So people saying that their life in general just feels lonely. Then there's many more people, probably an extra 10 million or more, who would say they're kind of sometimes lonely. And so this is affecting a lot of people. And when you say that you're chronically lonely, this would be a major issue in your life. And it has longer term health effects, which are important in their own right, but they kind of tell you how deeply loneliness affects people. So yeah, this is an issue that affects millions of people acutely, and many more millions of people less acutely, but in still a way that we're having a real impact on their life. So yeah, it's a big issue, and it's something which needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And so coming back to my second point there is this a new problem, or has this always been the case?
So basically, we don't really know. So those kinds of, obviously, loneliness is a kind of universal human emotion. There's been amazing anthropology talking to an incredible range of people, from pastoralists in sub-Saharan Africa to people affected by the explosion of the Fukushima nuclear plant in Japan to people in England. And you can see that it's a universal emotion. So in that sense, it's definitely not a new problem. It is, to some extent, part of what it is to be human. In terms of whether it's got better or worse, we don't know that, because, to be honest, we haven't really been asking people for very, very long, particularly outside of older people. So, is it the case that like the last 50 years has made loneliness worse? We don't really know, because obviously there's some things about modern life which makes it harder to have good relationships, but some ways in which it can be easier. So, for example, if someone moved to Australia in the 1950s, they were never particularly expecting to see their family again because it was such a very, very long trip. Whereas now it's very easy to keep in touch with people across continents. So we think there's probably kind of pros and cons. But what we do know is that loneliness got worse in the pandemic, and it has not gone back to normal. There seems to be the effects of the pandemic in terms of how it kind of affected people's relationships, seems to have persisted. There's a tracking survey done by the Office for National Statistics, and it seems to be a kind of a raised level from what it was before.
So, just thinking this through, I mean, I appreciate that loneliness is a horrible kind of emotion to feel, but what are the kind of societal or the individual consequences of someone suffering from loneliness? There's the experiencing of the emotion, of course, that we wouldn't want anyone to have to experience, but where does it lead?
So yeah, this is one of the absolutely kind of core parts of our overall well-being, so yeah, it's really important in its own right, and particularly when it becomes chronic. And I think that you were just kind of alluding to it earlier, but I think it's almost the key thing about loneliness is that when you're lonely, the world feels like a more threatening place. Your social interactions often feel more stressful, and then people can often kind of brood and worry about their social interactions. They can remember things that didn't go quite right. So I've had this example that, if you're not lonely and you're going to a party where you don't know many people, you kind of go, well, I don't know many people, but I'm sure it'll probably be fine. And then afterwards, you kind of goes, well, that was a party, it was nice. Because if you are lonely, the idea of going to that place feels really scary, and you will find being there more difficult. You'll be much more alive to people noticing you, not noticing you, and you'll often brood about it afterwards. So it can be, people can then withdraw from social contact and become very isolated as well. So it is in itself very, very important. In terms of its other effects, loneliness by itself is thought to be an equivalent kind of risk factor for major health risk factors like obesity or physical activity. And if you put loneliness together with social isolation and living alone, you're more into a kind of tobacco or smoking kind of place. Similarly for mental health, being lonely makes you much more likely to become depressed or kind of clinically socially anxious as well. So the effects of the individual are great. Obviously, people and then I think for wider society, obviously there are kind of costs in terms of healthcare, costs in terms of workplace. So people who are not lonely at work seem to be much better engaged at work, whereas people who are lonely enjoy their work much less, feel less engaged with it, and to some extent can be less good colleagues as well, because their interactions with colleagues they're perceiving with more kind of threat, and less kind of cooperation and kind of friendliness that is so important to any kind of successful workplace.
Yeah.
We think the impact on individuals can be very severe. There are also serious effects for the wider society as well.
Sure. So tell me about your work with the campaign to end loneliness. I mean, what is it that you're actually doing?
So our job is not to do all the research, to do all the services. Our job is to kind of be the place that these things come together. And so, for example, things that we're doing, we've just released a report about loneliness and the built environment. So you might think, well, loneliness is to do with your social relationships. Why would where you live make a difference? But actually, what we've found is that where you live can actually make quite a big difference. So if you think about your neighbourhood, there'll be some places where you might feel quite comfortable chatting to people, places where people might come together, other places perhaps where you really wouldn't want to linger. Perhaps it's by a busy road, or it's a place that feels threatening or not safe. And actually what we found is that loneliness is higher in some places than others for reasons that can't be explained just by who's living there. There's more young people, there's more old people, differences of income and so on. So it seems to be the case that where people live can make a real difference to their chance of loneliness. And we saw similar things in the pandemic. So some types of places became more lonely in the pandemic, and some places became less lonely. So, for example, in London, places with more independent shops saw a lower increase in loneliness than places with fewer independent shops. So places which had less kind of going on, fewer connections. So we think that there's a lot that we can do in the built environment to make them better places for connection. So that's both about having places where people can come together to form really important bonds and relationships. So kind of community centres, cafes, pubs, those types of places, but also places where people can bump in together, just those kind of weak ties. So a place where you might feel comfortable saying hello to your neighbour, or a park where you'll kind of chat to someone who you vaguely know because their kids are in the year below yours at school. That kind of, those types of interactions, both the light ones and also the more serious ones, can both be facilitated by where you live. And then the other thing which we're very excited about and only a little bit stressed about is at the beginning of February, we are having an international conference about loneliness, because this issue, which actually has been pioneered in many ways in the UK, is absolutely kind of spreading across the world. And we'll be having speakers from the US, from Japan, from Australia and Zimbabwe and Tanzania as well. And we're hoping for a really lively, interesting day where people can learn about loneliness and what we can do about it from right across the world.
Talking about what we can do about it. Now, I mentioned right at the beginning, we probably all know somebody who maybe we think might be suffering from loneliness, or maybe that you listen to this podcast and the Retirement Cafe is often listened to by people in their retirement years, and they're kind of going, you know what? Yeah, I may not have told anyone before, but actually my internal voice says, yes, I'm lonely. What are the strategies people who either know somebody or even yourself, if you're feeling that way, can do? What is it that they can do?
Well, I think that to some extent one can be lonely without having fully realised it. And so if you are having that thought that actually listening to this, I think that this might apply to me, I think kind of the first step really is firstly kind of acknowledging it. I think also understanding how it might be influencing your psychology a bit as well, in terms of what I was saying about things that you didn't used to find difficult now feel scarier or more overwhelming. And so in terms of what you can do about it, the reasons for loneliness are quite personal, and so what you do about it is quite personal as well. But things that can help are, as I say, kind of acknowledging it, trying to remember things that you've done in the past that have gone well, and so paying more attention to those things that have gone well than things where you might be kind of worried. When you're lonely, it's very easy to kind of brood on a social situation that didn't go quite right. It's which life is full of. If life is full of forgetting to call someone back, jokes that don't quite work, all of that kind of stuff. But when you're not lonely, you can brush those off. When you are lonely, it can be harder, but it's worth recognizing it might be loneliness talking. And then the thing to do really is to think about what it is that might help you to be less lonely. And that could be doing something that you have done before. So it might be a kind of an activity or an interest, or it might be someone who you've slightly lost touch with. So it's really worth working out how you could reconnect with people as well. But in terms of kind of, if you want to do something new, then a particularly good thing to do is things like kind of volunteering, because that is a really great way of bringing you together with kind of like-minded people with a kind of shared interest in life. Because what's kind of striking about loneliness is that it's a really serious issue, but no one really wants to go to a loneliness cafe. And so what you do about loneliness is often some of the most interesting and kind of meaningful things in life. So thinking about what that might be for you is a really good way to try to get out of loneliness. But I think whenever I say that, I always kind of feel this thing, which is it's about 5 million times easier to say it than it is to do it, because these things can be quite overwhelming. It can be quite difficult to know what to do with them. But but it's important to try to get out of it, because it will you'll probably find it easier than you imagined, and the effect on your life will be really significant.
I do love the tactic there, I think, of I'm often reminded, especially at Christmas time, the pleasure in giving a gift is actually much greater usually than actually receiving a gift. And I've had some lovely gifts, which is fantastic. But the delight on your children's faces, or your friends' faces, or your family's faces on receiving a gift that you've been thoughtful of, is significant, isn't it? And the volunteering thing that I think you just mentioned is a similar scenario, because you're giving of your time. But of course, the reward back to you with the social interaction, the feeling of doing something worthwhile, I've done some good today, it is the gift of your time, isn't it? And your gift of your energy and maybe your talents into whatever you're volunteering in can deliver significant health benefits, I suppose, from that loneliness aspect, but also that just feeling of actually, today's a good day because I've helped somebody.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think actually in the context of retirement, this is particularly important, because in terms of what makes people lonely, one of the biggest things is change in life, moving from one place to another, changing jobs, changing relationships. But the move from working to not working, particularly if it's quite abrupt, you kind of trad kind of getting your carriage clock kind of way, is a massive shift in your life, and people can lose meaning. They can lose a lot. You can get a lot of really great social activity and real friendships at work. And so that change is a really big one. And so how can you manage that? How can you make that change in a way that keeps you really engaged in society, and perhaps having the time to do things that you really want, kind of volunteering is absolutely a really, really good way of doing that.
So I think, Robin, the other just as I kind of tie this up, the other thing that I'm hearing from you, and I'm feeling it would be a good solution if you are sat there listening and thinking, yeah, this might be me, or actually I can identify someone else locally to me who may be feeling that way, then probably the greatest opportunity you have is to knock on their door and say hello. Purely, I mean, maybe that's easier said than done if you're feeling very insular and lonely, etc. But just the feeling that the person down the road may be feeling like you are, and would welcome that opportunity to have some communications, to have some social interaction, and maybe they need something doing, or again that could be that volunteering of, we saw this in the retired community that Christchurch is, where I'm from, that in the pandemic, etc., there was lots of us who were maybe shopping for elderly people, or who were struggling to get to the supermarkets or delivery slots, or what have you, and it did create a feeling of community, that actually there was something going on to help other people, and maybe some of those relationships have continued, which of course is wonderful. But if you are feeling like that, maybe reaching out to someone who else is feeling like that could be a significant opportunity to help somebody else who is feeling slightly low or lonely, but also would benefit yourself. So maybe that is another opportunity.
Yes, absolutely. So being useful to other people is a really important way of connecting with people, and it is a really important part of our self-worth. So I think some of the most useful ways of combating loneliness, for example, can be connecting people who are in kind of care homes, where people are quite frail, with younger children, and can give new parents a bit of a break. But the kind of opportunity to chat and to reflect and to read stories, it can be a great form of connection across generations, but where we're all kind of helping each other rather than it being a kind of top-down kind of relationship. And yet, as you say, just you don't have to solve every problem in someone's life to still be having a really useful effect on their life. So if you're thinking it's someone might be lonely, you don't have to be the one who, as it were, saves them from it. But if you're just having a few interactions, a few hellos, then that can really, really lift people's day. The evidence about kind of light social interactions lifting people out of loneliness is really quite surprisingly strong. And so I think I'd absolutely urge people to think about how they can be useful, but also just those little bits of friendliness can make a real difference too.
Yeah. Well, Robin, it's been fascinating talking to you, and I think you're doing some great work. And this, as you identified, it's a huge problem, and maybe even bigger than is possible to identify. Because how many people are putting their hand up and saying this is me. Where can people find out more about you and the great work that you're doing?
So if you search for Loneliness UK, then we'll be your top item, and we've got a website that we've just refreshed and we're very proud of, that can talk about the kind of slightly more kind of heavy duty research things that we do. There's also got some great advice and links to the many brilliant organisations in this country who provide services to help people get out of loneliness.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put all those links in the show notes, so people can find all those organisations and find out more about you. Thanks for your time today, Robin.
Thanks ever so much for having me.
Thanks once again for Robin for joining me today with some useful tips on how to help someone who is suffering from loneliness. To find out more about the campaign to end loneliness, check out the show notes on our website at theretirementcafe.co.uk, where of course you'll find some useful links. As ever, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps more people like you find us. And for more interviews and retirement planning videos, you may want to check out my YouTube channel, which is Justin King MFP. Just search for Justin King MFP, or of course you could click the link in the show notes. If you want to get in touch, you can reach me on hello@theretirementcafe.co.uk or via Twitter @JustinKingCFP. So until next time, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.